Hey everybody, what's up? It's David Ariev here again for iDesign.com, coming to you with part 2 of this very in-depth Mars tutorial. Now today is all about these KitBash3D buildings, and we'll be starting with them in a clean scene where we can retexture them and bring a lot more life to the buildings. Then we'll be moving them over to our previous environment and integrating them into the landscape, as well as doing a bunch of lighting techniques that should highlight the buildings and bring out a lot more mood and atmosphere. Now, to quote anyone who's ever posted a render on the internet, I hope you like it. Alright, so this is kitbash3d.com, and I can't say enough good things about this site and these packs. There's really nothing out there that's this accessible for small teams and solo artists, and these kitbash packs really open up a whole world of creating sophisticated looking renders that wasn't available before. And many of these just have a crazy amount of detail, and it's very much like Legos in that it takes out the most painstaking part of the process, which would be modeling, and just focus on the lighting, mood, composition, texturing. Even though these all now come with textures, you can still go in and add additional details or swap out textures and make them look however you want. So we're going to go for this space colony because I'm trying to create this semi-realistic looking Mars as if scientists have just landed on the planet and started setting up camp. And here's the overall pack. And there's a lot of cool crinkly cloth-like textures and metal textures already in here, but we can probably beef these up even more. Now don't forget that we've got that promo code running. It's ArievBash, and that'll give you an awesome 15% discount off of any order at KitBash3D. Alright, so let's just merge in our space colony here. I'm going to use the FBX file, and I'll just frame up on these here. Now we're going to want to drop in maybe a floor and a daylight so that we can see the textures in a better context that's not so flat. So let's come over here and rotate around our daylight. And on the floor, I'm just going to create a diffuse material and set it to a dark gray. In the daylight, I'm going to take down the blue and the sky color and the orange as well. Okay, so first off, we can grab all of these and go to materials, convert materials, and materials remove unused materials. So now they're all Octane textures. And right now all of these are set to diffuse, which isn't going to give us the nicest result. So let's go in and change a few things. I like this angle on the daylight a bit better. So the first obvious thing to do is change this glass color. So here it says glass, but it's not. So let's just select specular. And let's also make sure we're looking at this in path tracing, and then set the GI clamp down to 1. And here under fake shadows, I'm going to turn that on, which will just brighten up the glass a bit. Alright, let's jump out here and deal with something like these textures, which are particularly ugly looking right now. Okay, so this is our dark plastic texture, and it exists all over the place on these doors and on these giant water containers or whatever these are. So in this case, let's deal with these first, but I want to treat this differently and maybe do more of a metallic texture here. So let's zoom on into this door, and first I'll just set the mode to glossy, and let's rotate our daylight so that we're actually getting some light hitting the surface. And let's go to our node editor here, and let's increase the roughness. So now it's actually catching some light. And for the time being, let's remove the bump so we can actually do something in the roughness. Let's just duplicate this texture and put it into the roughness. And then maybe play with the gamma. If we remove the diffuse, we can see a bit better what the roughness is actually doing. Let's drop in a gradient and make this a bit more extreme. So something like that. And let's bring back the diffuse. And let's bring the bump back, but not all the way mixed up. So let's put this in a multiply and then drop a float in here and bring this pretty far down. And this is looking pretty nice, but it's causing some firefly issues. So I think in the gradient we can just set this a little bit above black so that it's never fully shiny. And let's go even further with that. There we go, so that's cleaning up a lot more nicely. Okay, now let's treat this orange material here. Right click and select material. Set it to glossy. Bring up the roughness. And I think this could actually work as is. Maybe we bring down the specular a little bit because it's blowing out so much. That works for me, though over here, this one's got a lot of repetitions that I don't like. So if we select this object and hit our scroll to first active, you can also just get to this with Shift-C, scroll to first active. I've also got it set up as Alt-S. Now we can just select this individual material and scale it up here. Now we're seeing less tiling. Now if we want, we could throw color correction down here. And we could shift the hue and down on the saturation. Something like this might actually work better in our Mars environment since everything else is orange already. This might create an interesting color hit and draw our eye to the city more, but we won't really know until we're in context. So with this texture here, let's select this material. And again, let's choose glossy. And let's rotate around the daylight to maybe a better angle. So if we were back at diffuse, you can see there's no additional highlights here, but on glossy, it's a bit nicer, but we just need to up the roughness and bring the specular way down. So it's subtle, but that adds just a little bit of a sheen to the fabric. If we were to go back to diffuse, it would look like this. Okay, now let's deal with these guys. So if we right click, we can select object and then hit scroll to first active. And here, let's just duplicate this dark plastic material and replace it. Let's jump in here and click get active material and give ourselves more room. Now I'm going to lose these other two textures for the time being. Now one thing that jumps out to me is that there's this really hard line here, and this is due to the UV mapping, and we can fix this. So let's go UV transform and projection. Now the first thing you might do is try a cubic projection. So if we go to box here, we can lock aspect ratio and scale this up. But now we've got these other lines here instead. So this doesn't really help us that much. The answer to this is triplanar. So if we just drop in a triplanar node here, we want to select single texture because otherwise we'd have to connect this node up to each of these slots here. And then we also want the texture projection to be triplanar. So let's scale this back up. And now you can see with this blend angle, if it's down at 0, we have these hard lines. But if we pull it this way, we feather them out. So triplanar is basically just a feather. Now, actually, I'm looking to make a metal material, so we don't need the diffuse at all, but we can still use this same idea with the roughness map. So let's drop this in the roughness, and we'll just kill the diffuse and bring it down to black. And let's bring the index up. Now, this is a lot more subtle, and we'd probably never see this, but we can still use this same triplanar node here. So let's hold down Alt, connect it up, and then copy these over and pop them in. Now we've got it blending a little more nicely, though I think we want to scale it up a bit more. Let's get rid of this. Or actually, maybe we want to scale it down. I think I'm good with that, and we didn't need such an intense blend angle. Let's get rid of this too. And then in the bump, let's drop in a noise, so that we start to get this interesting dented metal. Let's go UV transform. Let's scale this one up, and then we'll combine this with a smaller noise. So we want a mixed texture node, and let's combine our big noise with our small noise. This one will scale way down. And on the contrast for the big noise, we can bring that up a little bit, or a lot, to get these more defined features. We'll mix this whole thing down later. Same thing with this contrast here. Now it's just blending 50-50, so we actually want a third noise that will define where we're seeing the big noise and where we're seeing the small noise. So let's just duplicate this, put it into the amount, and now you can see we're getting patches. So let's make this one even bigger. And then we really want to boost the contrast on this, so these will be perfectly defined areas. And let's scale this one up a bit more too. There we go, I'm liking that a bit better. Now let's add in a multiply and a float. And bring this on down so it's a little more subtle. Cool, and we can change maybe the specular to more of a copper. I think that's kind of interesting right there. Though maybe this one needs less contrast. So I'm seeing a lot of repetitions here, so let's select Object, scroll to First Active, and then set this one to 300 by 300. Rotate the daylight around so we can see what's going on. That's definitely better. Let's select this material as well. We can just take this and drag this on top here. Okay, let's fix up this white plastic material. This one also needs to be glossy. And let's increase the roughness. Let's ditch the bump for the time being so we can see what's going on. And let's bring in another texture for the roughness. I'll go to my polygon overlays. And this metal grime could be cool. Let's do this one. See if we can see that taking effect. Let's bring down our diffuse so we can just focus on the roughness. Pop a gradient in. And crunch these down a bit. Bring this one up. If we put our diffuse back on, and let's bring the bump back in. But let's also mix the bump down because it's a little bit too extreme. So I think that's more interesting. Now another thing we can do with this blue material, since we put a lot of effort into this copper bump material, we can just duplicate it and we can use it to overwrite this blue material. So if you hold down Alt, it'll fully replace this blue material. So that's cool, but now maybe if we want to distinguish it and bring back the blue, we can just go to our specular tab and shift this to blue. Maybe somewhere around there. And areas like this on the ramp where we're seeing texture repetition, let's just fix that. Select Object, scroll to First Active. Okay, in this case, I don't really want to scale up the bump, but I do want to scale up the other texture. So let's just duplicate this and replace. And then come into our node editor and up the transform on the roughness. So that works for me. And finally, I want to fix up these solar panels. So let's select Object, scroll to First Active. It looks like there are glass panels over top of every one of these, so let's duplicate the glass and replace it. And if we look at solar panels, they're just kind of a bluish material with checkers. We're not going to be that close to these objects, so it doesn't matter if we totally nail it, but in general, that's what we want. So in this glass, let's just change it to a glossy material. And let's just put an image texture into the diffuse. And now I'm going to scroll down and find a tiles texture. So something like this ambient occlusion map should actually work pretty well. So let's just dump that in there. And let's UV transform and scale it down. And let's invert it. And now let's boost our index and change the specular to a blue. Okay, I think this actually works, and when you rotate on an angle, you see that they look a lot more like solar panels. So they call this a KitBash for a reason. For instance, let's take one of these X joints here and bring it back. And then let's grab a hallway from over here, one of these hallway mediums, scooch it on over. And all these pieces are designed to line up really nicely. Then we can even look over here at one of these habitats. Maybe this, for instance. And bring it on over. And you can see this even comes with a little bridge piece. Now some of them over here don't. Like if we look at some of these on platforms, let's grab this one. And let's move this circular one back. So let's just, for ease of use, let's drop this hallway under this X joint and duplicate this over. So you can see this doesn't line up, but there's actually a piece right here for that purpose. Let's scoot this over, and let's also move this underneath the X joint, and let's duplicate this up as well. And let's move this up to the top so we've got all of these three together. And let's scooch this over. And now we could go and find this piece, for instance. Rotate it 90. Actually, maybe in this case we need this one. And we could scale it up a bit just to cheat it in there. And hold down Control and duplicate this again. And maybe we actually scale this one down slightly. Push it forward, move it up. But you can see how easy it is to create larger constructs. The same thing goes over here with these pieces. There are X joints, and then there are turns and 45-degree turns, and these corridors also connect up to the smaller ones. And there's some really interesting detail in some of these pieces, like this large airlock that has cords coming out. So with just enough work and some kind of Zen sessions, you can build up some pretty big complexes of these tunnels and make your own city. Take a look at the concept art for this pack, for instance. There's just networks of these things, and this artist went to town in making these little complexes and building up these pretty elaborate looking structures. Alright, so I'm just going to group all this with Option G and call it Space Colony. I deleted out the sun and the plane. I'm just going to copy this whole thing into our Mars project file and paste it in. And immediately you can see that we've got an issue. I kind of screwed up because these two scenes are totally different scale. And what that means is when I scale this down to size, which I will, it'll change the resolution of all of those textures that we put effort into. So I'm going to have to go back and make some tweaks to those textures. This can definitely make your life more difficult if you're not comparing scene scale. And a good test would have been just going in here and copying in one building to start, just to see what the scale difference is. And then going back to this scene here where we did our texture work and scaling everything down, and then start texturing. Or if you want, you can also just immediately bring all the buildings in here and turn off the stuff that makes this hard to navigate, like turn off all these rocks and things and do your texture work in here, which could have actually been even better since all of this is in context and in the lighting conditions that we're actually going to use. So let's just turn off most of these things other than the sand to see how our textures are doing. And let's duplicate this main cam and zoom up to some of these buildings so we can see what's going on. So it actually looks like on the whole we're doing okay, especially because these big buildings are UV textured, so their textures are not ever going to change when we scale things up and down. Whereas these tanks are the things I was most concerned about. I think this is still looking just fine, so I'm actually not going to bother making any changes, especially since we're going to be pretty far back from all this stuff. I'm going to bring back all of our objects so that we can better place these buildings. Okay, and I think the first thing that's bugging me is this blue material is too extreme, so let's go to the specular and tone it down. And at this point we want to start with a clean slate, so I'm just going to hide this space colony from render, and then I'm going to go and untick check camera so that we can look around and select buildings and then bring them in one at a time. Okay, so let's start with these large square buildings here. And let's bring it out of the hierarchy. Okay, and unfortunately this is like way too slow to navigate. So what I can do at this point is make things a little easier on myself and create a new layer. A couple new layers. One we'll call Essentials, and the next we'll call Extras. And so any of these things up here that we don't need to block out the composition, we'll just drag into Extras. Same thing goes with all these. And when we're dragging in, make sure to hold down Control so that we get all the children as well. And now I'm going to just turn this off from the render and from view. Okay, so let's go back to our layers and turn the extras back on for a second. Cool, so the idea I've just had with this image is to create kind of a downtown or set of really tall buildings here in this zone, because I feel like all of these jagged cliffs and lines are kind of pointing us to here, and this is pointing us to here as well. So this feels like the focal point to me, and I also don't want to cover this cool detail of this cliff in the background. So I'm going to cluster those tall buildings kind of way over the hill, and I want to bury them in the fog so that they feel really big. But then I also want to create some smaller buildings and complexes that would sit down in here, and this would give us a couple regions for our eye to travel. There's not much going on down here, so it makes sense to put some of these buildings here, and then our eye would follow this up towards these big buildings, and if we want, we could even put some guy sitting right here in the foreground or something like that. So again, let's turn these extras off for while we're working, and I'm gonna untick check camera here, and then I'll jump into this other camera. And it's still difficult to navigate the viewport, so what I can do is just shut this off fully, and then it's a lot faster to move around. And I actually want to see these extras for a second just in the viewport so I can make sure that I'm positioning this building properly. And now let's just scale this way up. And then bring it up as well so that we see a bit more at the bottom of it. Now if we bring back our extras here, maybe rotate this building around, something like that. This is looking a lot more promising because the fact that this is buried a little bit in the fog means that we're going to perceive it as a lot bigger. And I also like this highlight that we're catching up here. And the other nice thing is this focal point here is close to the third line, which is another good thing, and that creates some more visual interest. So maybe we'll have some stuff here and then some stuff over here. Okay, I'm going to place several more buildings and then we'll come back to check this out. Alright, we're back. So you can see I've made a bunch of changes. I've placed all the buildings for this kind of downtown area here, and I've lengthened a lot of them to make them feel a little bit taller and more epic. So I've just scaled them on the y-axis. I've scooted this mountain into the background a bit to give it a bit more perspective haze, and that way it's not competing as much with these buildings and it's a little bit lower down. And then I added in this mountain range as well as the one back here behind these satellite dishes. Now the satellite dishes I found on NASA's website. So if you just Google NASA 3D, you'll find this page, and then in the 3D models here you can scroll down, and it's this DSN 70-meter dish. It downloads as a Blender file though, so you'll have to convert it to an OBJ or an FBX to use it. But I thought this added a lot, and it's cool seeing these kind of buried even further in the background, these massive satellite dishes. Now the last change I wanted to make was just this slight shift in the camera. I panned it over a bit because this puts the buildings more on this third line, and I think this is just a bit of a nicer composition. Okay, next I'd like to add just a few little lights to these buildings, which I think will help sell the scale a bit more, and maybe a bigger ambient light emanating from within these buildings, which will draw our eye to them even more, and maybe add a bit of mystery, like there's some kind of construction project or something crazy going on down in here that we can't see. So I'm going to jump back to our layers here and turn off the extras, and I'll jump into this other camera here so we can navigate around. And I'm also going to turn off the volume. So let's drop in an Octane area light, and let's find this building here. We'll just drop this light underneath this and hit reset PSR, and then bring the light back out. So here what we can do is, under the details of this light, we can change it to sphere, and then let's just scale it down. So I'm just going to create 4 of these for this building, 1 on each corner. Now let's see what that's doing from our hero camera perspective. And we'll turn back on our volume. I think these all need to be a bit smaller, so we can scale them all down at once from their own axis if we turn on per object manipulation. If this isn't on, they'll scale down as a group like that. But if you turn this on, then each of them will scale down on its own axis. And let's maybe move these up. Let's move them back a little bit. And then let's scale them back up because I think we've gone too far. And when I crank up the power really high, these become a little bit more interesting. Let's also try shifting the temperature. And then in our Octane camera tag, let's just turn up saturate to white. So we get a white hot center on these. Now, I don't necessarily want these to be casting so intensely on these other buildings. So if we go back here, we can just untick visible on diffuse, visible on specular, and cast shadows. And now we're no longer getting this intense casting on these other buildings, which is good. We just want these to show up as little bright spots. So I'm going to pause while I go ahead and add these to other buildings, and then I'll come back. Alright, so I've added in a few more buildings here, a couple tanks, and a bunch of little lights all over the place. Next, let's add in some more ambient lights in here and maybe some underneath this tank here just to highlight some additional details. Alright, so we can just take one of these point lights and duplicate it and then scale it way up. And this one, we're going to want the opacity to be 0 here so that we're not actually seeing the light source. And let's have it visible on diffuse, visible on specular, and cast shadows. And I'll go back to my layer and turn off the render extras here so that things go a bit faster. And then I'll just bring this on down somewhere in the middle of all these buildings. Let's go back to our main cam here. You can see that's way too powerful and crazy, obviously. But let's turn off check camera so we can navigate around and make changes here, but see everything from the hero viewpoint. Let's take the power of this light down to 440. And now let's move it a little further back and see what different effects we get. I think I like that, but let's see what it looks like at a more neutral color. Or maybe even a bluish color. Okay, I don't like the blue, so let's go back here. Okay, I think I'm liking it around 6000 as this slightly artificial bluish light, but not too crazy blue. Though I'm going to continue playing with the position so that it's maybe not illuminating this front face as much and see what we can do here. Okay, so that's kind of cool. I'm going to duplicate this and see what happens if we bring it over here as well. And that's obviously way too bright, so let's just scale these down, both of them. And when we scale these down, they get dimmer and they don't cast as far, which also helps the scale of the scene. So especially this one I want to make small. Maybe a bit bigger. So I like this where there's just a little bit of blue casting from on the ground behind this building. Let's try duplicating this smaller light around to different areas. Like maybe down in here. And another one on this side. And this kind of thing is an interesting detail that brings out the shape of this a bit more. Though in this case, maybe I don't like that it's casting so much here. I like this detail, so maybe we'll change this from a spherical light to a rectangle. And that way we can just point it the direction we want. Let's bring it a little bit closer here to this tank. And it looks like I pointed it the wrong way around, so let's flip it 180. And I'll turn it slightly this way so it's not casting here as much. Maybe I'll lengthen this out actually, so that it's hitting the back of this building as well. And then we're probably going to have to reduce the power. On second thought, I don't love how hazy this is getting, so let's just do one light for here and one light to try to accentuate this edge. So let's bring this back, place it behind this thing, and then we'll duplicate out another one and maybe elongate this vertically. So I think that's kind of an interesting little detail, though this one is still maybe too bright. Let's see if we can do the same for this bigger edge here. See, now that's starting to look kind of cool. So I'm going to go through and do this process to the rest of the buildings and find little areas that I want to highlight, and I'll come back to you in a bit. Alright, so I've added in a bunch more lights and brought out as many of the details as I could, added in this additional building and put this rim light on it, and let's take a look at what we've done so far. So here's without any of the lights that we put in. So here's the before and after. So that's adding in a lot of nice little details there. Alright, next I'm going to go and add in a bunch of little buildings down here, all the lower lying type buildings. Okay, so here I'm just going to make sure that the ground is always touching these so that we've got the proper context shadows and so that these habitats aren't buried in the ground. So I use MC for that, and then again I want to make sure I'm on normal mode. And it's pretty tricky because we actually have 4 planes that are creating the ground, so unfortunately I don't know a better way to do this, but I'm just going to have to go through and make sure each one is pushed downwards to reveal the habitat. So I just found another composition that I'm liking a lot, and this makes these background buildings and these satellite dishes feel a lot more massive. And this could be great for adding in like your little Beeple's people or whatever spaceman or Mars rover you want. Alright, I'm going to keep adding more little details to this scene. So there's also, of course, a ton of cool stuff on TurboSquid that you could pick up if you've got the budget for it. All these are pretty sweet. I've had this one for a while, and I'm just going to remove the guns and drop that in. Alright, so I've added in those sci-fi vehicles, and now I'm going to find my space dude and add him in too. And if any of you are wondering, this is the model here that I used on my space music video a couple years ago. Alright, so I've got my astronaut dude in there, just plopped on down. And I've got these other little astronaut guys back here. Interestingly, I had to boost his texture because he was looking really gray. But weirdly, when I did that, these guys blended into the background so much you couldn't even see them. So I split out the textures so that they could stay darker, and this guy is lighter. And the other really obvious thing was he was super out of focus, so I took down the shallow depth of field, and then I realized that the scaling on the sand texture was a bit too large, so I brought it down to half size, and now it's looking a lot better. Cool, so now let's take a look at our composition from up high between those canyons. Alright, here's where I got with this composition. I changed the scaling on the cliffs so that there's more detail, and I also boosted the noise displacement here and changed this one away from Hamma, which was causing some distortions, into a regular noise, which just gives it more of a curvy kind of flow. Now I've also gone and placed a bunch of extra lights down in this smaller colony area here, and I don't necessarily like it that much with this strong sunlight on, but remember we saved out a nighttime look earlier, so let's navigate over to that. So this scenario took a lot longer to render because it's a bunch of little lights in a dark environment, and that's kind of a nightmare scenario with unbiased rendering, but the results are kind of worth it in this case. I think this is a really interesting and different look, and this kind of setup is where you can really go to town with your lighting and emphasize tons of little shapes and edges, and the more you put into it, the more complicated and interesting it ends up looking. Alright, congrats you guys, you got through it, and I hope you really learned a lot. And as always, feel free to tag me if you do any kind of Mars or KitBash3D render using these techniques. I love seeing what you guys build with this stuff. And one last shout out to the Ariev Bash promo code. If you want 15% off, definitely enter that in. So that should be a sweet deal for you guys. And as always, keep calm and render strong. Or something like that. That's maybe an expression, right? See you guys later.